Okay, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm happy to be speaking alongside such distinguished scholars and economists and experts on this issue, and it really is an important issue to nail down. And so I'm glad that this conference is happening virtually. I'm going to talk about interpreting these statistics. There are a lot of different measures, and the last presentation really did a good job of discussing some of the key issues that underlie these. From a policy perspective, from a kind of programmatic perspective, what is key is trying to figure out what to take away from these different measures. And so I wanted to spend some time on that. Why do we care about these statistics? We care because they allow us qualitative judgments about social and economic phenomenon, or at least that's a big part of the reason why we care. In this context, what we really want to know is whether the U.S. is characterized by opiate or not, and to what extent that is the case. We want to know that to design good public policy. We want to know that in order to implement programs well. We want to know that in order to just understand the society that we live in, and what the implications of that are for a whole range of issues. A challenge with mobility statistics is that it's difficult to answer that question even if there weren't debate over methodology and statistics. If everybody agreed, okay, this is absolutely the right way to measure this phenomenon, it would still, I think, be difficult to form a kind of qualitative interpretation of these statistics. And so let me explain what I mean by focusing on these two kind of simple questions. Is intergenerational income rank sticky, and are intergenerational rags to riches transitions common? In order to look at these, I use data from the panel study of income dynamics that was referenced earlier. And what I do is relatively simple. I take individuals who are in their 40s today, and for sample size considerations, I define today as the previous three waves of the PSID from 2013 to 2017, and I want to focus on this age range to control for life cycle effects. People are still kind of ramping up their earnings in their 20s and 30s. People are ramping down their earnings in their late 50s and 60s. So I want to kind of hone in on the 40s as a way to control for those sorts of life cycle earnings dynamics. I want to do just a couple of basic things. Make sure that we're making an apples-to-apples comparison between different points in time by adjusting for inflation and by adjusting for household size, because household composition has been changing over time, as well as consumer prices. I use longitudinal weights for the analysis, and then in order to deal with the fluctuations that were referenced in the previous presentation, I take an average of annual income across these years, and I want to interpret that as kind of permanent income, or at least the permanent component of income, hoping that gets rid of year-to-year transitory fluctuations in a satisfactory and compelling way. And then I want to use this to compute a transition matrix, and this is the matrix. So along the x-axis, going from left to right, you have 5 income quintiles that show where a person was raised in the income distribution. So was the person raised in the bottom income quintile, the bottom 20%, that's the leftmost bar, or was a person raised in the top 20%, the top quintile, that's the rightmost bar. The middle bar is the middle quintile, that's being raised from the 40th percentile to the 60th percentile. And then along the y-axis, the question is, where do people end up? So where are 40 somethings? Where are people in their 40s today? Are they in the first, second, third, or fourth, or fifth quintile? And just to take an example, if you look at the top right blue bar, what that says is that 37, I think it's 37. I can't. It's too small, but it looks like 37. 37% of people who were raised in the top 20% remain in the top 20% as adults in their 40s. And so the question is, does this represent stickiness? On the one hand, you can argue that over a third of people who were raised in the top 20% stay in the top 20% as adults, and that makes it sound sticky. That makes the United States sound something like a class society where there's not a lot of upward mobility. At the same time, you can interpret exactly the same coefficient, exactly the same probability, and argue that well over 1/2 of people who were raised in the top 20% don't stay in the top 20% as adults. That spin on the statistic makes it sound like there's quite a bit of upward mobility in the United States. And both of those are completely accurate ways of characterizing the data. The same thing is true on the bottom. So if you look at the bottom leftmost bar, the light blue bar, what that shows is that about 36% of people who were raised in the bottom 20% remain in the bottom 20% when they're in their 40s. That said that way, it sounds sticky, right? It sounds like, oh wow, a third of the people who were raised there stay there. Again, you can interpret this in a completely different way. You can say well over half of the people who were raised in the bottom 10 make it out of the bottom 20% as adults. And so, figuring out which of those interpretations you think is most accurate is tricky business. And in my view, there's no real easy answer. Rags to riches is another kind of common question that people have about upward mobility. Is it possible for people to really rise up and have like a Horatio Alger rags to riches type experience? And here you see that the top left green bar, what that shows is that about 7 out of every 100 people who were raised in the bottom 20% make it to the top 20% when they're adults in their 40s. 7% is a small number, but when you're thinking about whether or not, in a qualitative sense, America is characterized by the possibility of a rags to riches story, you wouldn't expect it to be common, right? The issue is not whether it happens frequently or often or typically. The question is whether it's possible. And so, do we think that 7 out of every 100 people who were raised in the bottom 20% making it to the top 20% as adults, does that suggest that it's possible? Does that suggest that you're not surprised when you see it? Does that mean that your answer to the question, is America a rags to riches society, is your answer yes or is your answer no? It's just difficult. Likewise, you see that a roughly similar share of people who are raised in the top 20% end up in the bottom 20% as adults. That's that bottom green bar. green bar there as well. Does that suggest that we have a lot of riches to rags? That's something that I think, people who really, want to see a great deal of income mobility, look to see whether or not you have a riches to rags type story. They look to see what that bottom right bar that I've highlighted in green here looks like, but it has to interpret it. There are broader challenges with interpreting this. What's the right amount of relative mobility? People I think, are very enthusiastic about economic mobility, but do we think that a situation where if you were raised in the top 20%, you had a 20% chance of being in the bottom 20%, a 20% chance of being in the next quintile, a 20% chance of being in the middle quintile, 20% chance each of being in the next two quintiles? Do we think that is the right amount of relative mobility? I mean, I think a lot of people would view that as too much mobility. The idea that it's essentially a coin flip where you end up. But if that's too much, and if zero mobility is too little, how do you figure out what the right amount of mobility is? That's a really tricky question that you can't just read off of a spreadsheet table. So another way to measure mobility, which is simpler, I think, than a transition matrix kind of relative mobility approach, is by looking at absolute mobility. Absolute mobility just says, are you doing better off than your parents did in an intergenerational context? In an intragenerational context, is asked, are you doing better off than you were before? Everything I'm showing is intergenerational. I think it's easier to form qualitative judgments using absolute mobility statistics, but I think it's still difficult to arrive at firm conclusions. So the question is, is the U.S. characterized by upward absolute mobility? Here I use the same data and the same types of statistics, and I, ask a really simple question. Are people who are in their 40s today, do they experience a higher household income than their parents did when their parents were in their 40s? And the red bar on the shows that about 73% of people who are in their 40s today do experience a higher amount of income than their parents did when their parents were in their 40s. For people who were raised in the bottom quintile, 86% have higher household income than their parents had. And for people who were raised in the second quintile, 76% do. So, is that a lot? Is that something we should be happy with? It could be 100%. It could be 100%. There's no kind of statistical reason everybody can't end up earning more money than their parents did. It's not like a situation with a relative mobility transition matrix where it's kind of a zero-sum measure. In this case, you can get 100%. We don't have 100%, but for people who were raised in the bottom quintile, we have 86%, and across all adults, we have 73%. Does that mean America is characterized by upward mobility or not? It's a hard question to answer. I do the same thing with labor income, and here you see about 79% of people raised in the bottom quintile end up earning more than their fathers did, and on the whole, it's about 6 and 10. So 6 and 10 is closer to 50-50 than household income, which makes it even harder to answer the question.